The second half of chapter 3 is on externalities, which is also a very interesting topic in public economics. So one gets positive and negative externalities. So externalities are external effects coming from consumption or production. So you can have positive or negative effects from people consuming goods or from firms producing goods. I think the most famous or well-known externality is the negative production externality of air pollution or any kind of pollution. Factories pollute rivers and they pollute the air. So they don't do this on purpose. So an externality is always coincidental. They just want to produce and make profit, but in the process they have negative effects on the environment. A negative consumption externality, which we have referred to in the previous video, I didn't call it externality, but it's road congestion. So I consume the road. I want to get to work or go shopping. So I don't intend to cause the traffic jam, but every extra car, every marginal car on the road makes things worse. And not a single car on the road had the intention to do that, but I'm consuming my car services, and in the process I have a negative effect on someone else. So there's also a famous positive production externality. So there could be a bee farmer living next door to a maize or a sunflower farmer. The bees pollinate the sunflowers free of charge. So the bee farmer wants to have honey. That's his intention. But in the process of producing honey, his bees pollinate the neighbor's flowers. It's not intentional, but the neighbors get positive external effects. Someone could consume the luxury of driving in a beautiful car, and then I get a positive effect from that because I stare at the car and I really like to see the car. The person consuming the services of the car doesn't want to please other people. He or she just wants to drive around in a very nice car, but they have spillover effects of people wanting, loving to see the car. So a very important graph for you is figure 3.3, and you have to read section 3.6.1 very carefully. It's very important. So we have a typical supply and demand curve, private supply and private demand curve, and with equilibrium at E0. So this is the supply of electricity. But let's say it's coal-fired power stations producing the electricity, so there are negative effects. They pollute the air. But the private cost, the marginal private cost positive curve, which I have highlighted, doesn't include any pollution effects. It's just the private cost of the firm producing the electricity. And then there's a market demand curve, which we also call the marginal social benefit curve, because we as demanders are willing to pay certain prices for electricity and we get benefit from that. But if we take the social cost, the true cost of producing dirty electricity is higher. So if we shift the marginal cost curve up, then we get to the true cost. That's the private cost to the firm plus the cost to society. Society can become sick, or they can't breathe properly. It's uncomfortable for them to live in a town with lots of smoke in it. So the true cost of a negative externality is higher than the private cost, because there's a cost to society which needs to be added to the private cost. So the ideal equilibrium, so that the cost to society of the amount Q0 electricity is the vertical distance Q0F. That's the social cost of so much electricity being produced. So if we have the ideal situation, we would be at E1, where the demand curve is equal to the marginal social cost curve, the society marginal cost curve. So the ideal situation is to be at E1. But what does that mean? That means a private firm producing negative externalities are actually producing too much of it. So the government wants to intervene in some way and reduce the production so that there's less pollution. So if we could get to the ideal equilibrium, we would produce less, but the price would be higher. That's the key about externalities, is that usually the market produces too much of it and at too low a price. The market produces electricity at P0. It's too cheap. So the demand is too high and then the pollution is too high. But if we could get to point E1, we would have a lower level of electricity at a more realistic price, a higher price that also takes into consideration the social cost of the production. So in the textbook I've highlighted a few things. So 2 points are worth emphasizing. You should read this whole paragraph 361. It's important. 2 points. The market will always over provide and underprice goods that have negative externalities. And if we move to E1, we do not eliminate the externality. There's still electricity produced, but we have less of it, so it's closer to the optimal situation. We could also have a positive externality. So if we start again with the private demand curve and the private supply curve of, now we are talking about educational services. So since education has positive spillover effects, I mean, if people are educated, then the crime rates come down, the population growth rates come down. There's lots of positive effects, spin-off effects, which is not the goal of the education. Obviously, education is there to teach you and teach you skills which you can use. The education system doesn't have in its primary goal set that there will be less crime, but that's a positive spillover effect, that if people go to school, then they end up not going to jail. Anyway, so there's not enough of that. So now we want so that's the wrong equilibrium point. There's a social benefit. The private benefit to you and me is in the lower curve, but society benefits more than just the sum of our individual benefits. So the benefit of having zero amount of education is much higher than the equilibrium E0. So we want to move to point E1. We want to move on to the society marginal social benefit curve, which is the higher demand curve, and that could be achieved through, for example, a subsidy or so that we can see. So the ideal situation would be to have more education than that the private sector would have produced. That's why the government also gets involved, and at a higher price. So the benefits will be higher, but the price of the education will then also increase. But the optimal level of education is higher than what the private sector would produce, and hence the government should subsidize education, and that's exactly what they're doing. I'm having my eye on the clock, so I think I'm going to stop this video and continue in a new one, because otherwise YouTube will not allow me to make a YouTube video if it's too long. I'll see you just now.